and welcome to another edition of Turned Out a Punk. I'm your host, Damian Abraham, and once again, I'm bringing you a conversation with someone who grew up listening to punk, may or may not still be involved with punk, but had their life changed by the genre in a major way. And today on the show, huge guest, an amazing episode from the legendary band L7, and from lots of other stuff we talk about, some real interesting stuff on this one. Jennifer Finch is on the show today, and this is a good one. It's a long one, but it's worth it. More on that in 1 second. But first, if you'd like to get in touch with me, head over to the email address turnedoutapunkpodcast@gmail.com. That is run by my brother, who is the show producer and guest booker extraordinaire, Tristan Abraham, and he'll get the message to me. You can find me on various forms of social media at Left for Damian. The podcast has a YouTube page, a TikTok page, an Instagram page, a Facebook page. All those can be found at Turned Out a Punk on those platforms there. If you want to support the show by telling all your friends about it. Let them all know that there's a podcast that you really enjoy called Turned Out a Punk. You can also check out the band I play in over at fuckedup.cc. We are currently, I guess we just wrapped it up. Yeah, we've wrapped up. We've just wrapped up a tour with Superjunk, but we got more stuff coming up in the future, probably. You find out more information, though, at fuckedup.cc, records and all sorts of stuff. Probably leftover stuff from the tour, merch-wise as well. So head on over there. And on to today's show. Today on the show, as I mentioned off the top, is a fantastic guest. Jennifer Finch is on the podcast today. This was something that I didn't know what to expect. You know, I knew Jennifer was cool, heard her on other places and be interviewed before, and she was always awesome. But my gosh, this is a fun conversation. This is why you do this podcast, because you know they're all great. There's very few that are terrible, but every once in a while, there's one of these episodes that is just like, oh yeah, that's why we do this thing. I guess if you are not immersed in the world of L7, immerse yourself in the world of L7, a fantastic, hugely important band. Head over to l7theband.com and check out the L7 documentary. There's tons of amazing videos. They're reissuing a bunch of sort of key L7 records right now as they're coming up on their anniversaries. There is the Smell the Magic anniversary on Sub Pop, which is unbelievable. There's also the Bricks Are Heavy anniversary, which is coming up later on this year, the 30th anniversary of that record. And there is new music from L7, because they are a band that continues to put out fantastic records. And once again, find out more all over there at l7theband.com and catch them on tour. They're going to be going on tour this summer or spring, it looks like, and they're coming to your town. An unbelievable band, a huge band for me. I'm not going to ramble on anymore because it's a long episode and we go all sorts of cool places. A lot of interesting stuff in this one. That's it. Sit back, relax, and enjoy Jennifer Finch on Turned Out a Punk. Jennifer, it is an honor to have you on Turned Out a Punk.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, as I told you off air, I find you, like, I'm a huge fan of your music and multiple of your bands. We'll talk about not just L7, but we'll talk about a lot of the projects you kind of did post L7 too.
Okay, so who does your research?
Me. I'm a nerd.
Oh, wow, you
look
don't
at
have a full
look at this
team
shit.
for all of... I know, right? Yeah.
This is sadly when my wife's like, okay, can you please remember to get these things from the grocery store? And I remember 2 of the things that she told me to get from the list of 7,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm thinking about your connection to Savage Republic. It's like, this is why I'm not focused on the things I should be focused on, is because I'm focused on...
you have seen professionals over this, and did they try to medicate you when you were a child?
I have been. I was medicated more as an adult, and
Nice.
I feel like the medication that they put me on really is what set me on this path of fixation. And
Oh, interesting.
and now the cannabis just allows me to pontificate on it a little bit more and
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
elaborate on it a little bit more. But this is, as I say, going to be a huge thrill for me, and I hopefully bearable for you, but we got to start it off
Oh,
the way they
yeah.
all start off, which is Jennifer.
One person's having a thrill and the other's just bearing it. I like your come from.
Isn't that how all these interviews are? If like for the most part, it's just the interviewer.
I'm the thrill and you're bearing it.
Oh,
And you
believe
have
me,
you have the beard to prove that you're kind of in the bear category.
this isn't about
Bring it.
me. This is about you, Jennifer.
It's about us. It's
How'd you
about
get?
us.
How'd you get in a punk? Do you remember the first time you ever came across it?
How did I get turned out punk?
How did you get turned out a punk?
Yeah, I think that it's like the very typical story, as I've heard actually on many of your interviews. It started with a babysitter and then kind of ended at the record store. And in between, I had a babysitter who brought me Ramones and Devo and Buzzcocks, things that are kind of like really for kids and expression of childishness in punk rock. And we're talking early on, we're talking I don't have my age, but I am from a generation. Uh, so maybe like 77, 78. I was still quite little. I was very little, this little. And no one who's listening can see what I'm doing.
A small
But I was
child, but a child.
a small child. And then, it turned into when punk started to be covered. I grew up in Los Angeles. First off, I was born in Boyle Heights, California. I grew up on the west side in Los Angeles. I was adopted. I came through the foster system and I was adopted. And I was an only child being adopted. So a lot of resources were put into me. And I was going to say, like, that was a benefit of like what was a very kind of traumatic experience. So my father would take me to the bookstore, and eventually at some point I wandered into the music section. And by the late 70s, punk as a cultural expression, not necessarily a music expression, was in the LA Times and our local publications, but it was also landed on the bookshelves in the music section, in the art section, and in the fashion section. It became like an obsession, not for the music, but for everything else that punk did culturally. People started writing about it. It was proving, I think, what a lot of philosophers and thinkers were talking about in the 50s and the 60s about where society was going and like sort of the breakdown of the grand narrative. And although it was, punk music we know about, but it was all of these people jumping into the market to like sell their pop culture books on crazy fashion that was like ripped up and people that dyed their hair and people that cut their foreheads and, you know, um, movies and film and television in Los Angeles started to play around with having the punk extra or the punk environment to show troubled teens. You know what I mean? So like there started to be like a media kind of thing. So when I think about punk, I don't always just think about my first records. Although yes, they were important. My first exposure to music, though, was more about my parents were not music people, and I lived in a neighborhood that through the 70s started to be gentrified. And so people would have garage sales and be selling their records. So the first records that I got were like John Lee Hooker, Funkadelic, these records from the people that lived in my neighborhood were my first exposures. So looking back, I got the music education. I feel like I got to be involved in a conversation with, the original expressions of punk rock that were not yet in the white communities, that were not yet in the mainstream communities, that didn't hit England, like what rock and roll really was shaped, how it was shaped. And right away, right from what you could consider kind of record collector, marginalized, music that wasn't in the mainstream, I immediately jumped into punk rock. But with the punk rock, I was late into it, right? Like we talk about 76, the Damned's first record, Ramones, the expressions of, I don't even, people call it the pre-punk. What do you call like Patti
Protopunk
Smith?
kind of stuff.
Yeah, proto-punk. I don't even think it's proto-punk. It was just rock
Mm-hmm.
then.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could say that it led up to it, but I don't think it led up to it musically. It led up to it culturally. You know what I mean? The look of it led up to it. But the folks that were doing that music, like in New York and like even the Ramones, I feel like they were just tastemakers. They just wanted to be on major labels and change major labels. They weren't interested in counterculture or, that much different. I love Patti Smith, one of my all-time favorite artists. I, lick the ground she walks on. I've been in rooms with her and have never been able to talk to her. Like she is, you know what I mean? Yoko Ono, same. Like they are these original. I'm not even talking about female. I'm talking about punk.
Mhm.
To me, these are the original
Oh,
originators. And they weren't out to do punk. You know what? They were out to for mainstream recognition and to change the way people thought in mainstream, right? I think, in my opinion.
I
What do
think
you think?
I think what you're saying is fascinating too, because like I love that idea of like it's kind of being pre-foretold, and the idea that this sort of dream of the '60s culturally is going to eventually, oh hello, cameo, is going to break down, and you're going to have something's going to come out of it. And you're right, like it is from fashion, from to film to visual art to I'm sure dance and certainly theater. You hear about it happening a lot in New York in theater. Speaking of Patti
Mhm.
Smith, uh,
Yeah.
where there's this sort of new need for like a different type of expression, and it's amazing as it gets kind of like given a name, because you're right, there is something that happens prior to it that isn't necessarily sonically linked to it, but
Mhm.
is sort of like philosophically linked to it. And as this sort of coalesces into the genre, and then as it goes on, people begin rejecting the traditional trappings, like the idea that there is, and obviously everyone wants to get people to enjoy their band and to see their band, but you get to a point where by the late '90s, there's a complete rejection of any sort of mainstream success by a lot of bands, and the idea of like you have Fugazi almost taking a vow of poverty with their band just as like sort of a culmination almost of this sort of like philosophical thing that just anyway I'm
Yeah, but I mean, we have that earlier. I mean, we have that earlier in the squat cultures, and I think women talked about it more so, and we do have it with, like crass. I mean, that was much earlier, in that idea. And, there is with MC5 and the politics, I mean, it all went sideways for them, but some of their original philosophies did kind of express this idea of they wanted they weren't, they were the first punk band with like a top 100 hit, right? I mean, really what we're going to call proto punk in Canada. So your people.
but I mean with Fugazi, like I think all those other bands, you're 100% right, like this ethic of rejection of mainstream trappings certainly isn't unique to punk, but I think doing so solely in the name of punk, like why are you
Okay,
doing this
okay. Well,
because of
let's
punk?
stop right now for 1 second. I totally agree, but I want to add in something else to the conversation. You're talking about, because let's also let's throw Brett Gerwitz into this too, and let's throw Fat Mike into this. Um, how fun is it to be able to reject the mainstream when you already have a record label? So don't, I mean, and I like it, but it's kind of like that paradox that sometimes you call the Cobain paradox, right? It referred to as I didn't invent that, but where you're like, MTV sucks, and you're on the platform of MTV doing it, right? Or you're like, major labels suck, by my, and I get it because there's a desire to create commerce outside of the system, but it's still part of a system. And there's still a privilege that comes with being able to do that.
Oh, absolutely. And
Just saying.
no,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think Mike would push back on this, and I think probably I bet they probably push
Oh,
back
no,
on it.
he has. We've been talking about this since 1986.
But you're right. There's also like well, to go and to go a step back, there's also like a certain level of privilege to even be able to play music, obviously, to have equipment. But I mean, like to have the means to put out a record. And we certainly have had people on this podcast that have come on and said, yeah, the reason you don't hear music from my first band is because we were broke and we didn't have any friends that had any money to put out records. Like it was like survival for a lot of our stuff. And I think
Sure.
that's why certain scenes are better documented than other scenes, is because there was a greater means to capital. And you're 100% right. And I think it's also fascinating that you brought up those three people, because all of them, maybe not Brett, I don't really know Brett at all, but like all of them would wave the flag and say, I'm punk. This is punk. What I'm doing is punk rock. but both Ian and Fat Mike, I could not think of two people that are more diametrically opposed to each other philosophically on almost every other issue other than punk rock being independent and punk rock being
Sure.
a certain sonic.
Yeah, but they're just, I feel, well, I can tell you my perception is that like the things that make them different are really the accessories of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the things that kind of identify them as like uniquely human. But at the core, they're two people that run record labels. And they may philosophically think of it a little bit differently, but in a lot of their ideas about inclusion of artists who were what normally discluded, that's a huge similarity, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's, well, you go right down the line of all these independent labels. It's white males, not to undercut Laura Emerge, and there's certainly other women that were involved. And I think
Sure.
a lot of these labels were run by women when you actually start peeling back the layers, but it's a lot of white dudes in these positions to pick who the bands are and who got signed and who didn't get signed. And I think history is written in the margins in a lot of cases, and that's the amazing moment we're at now, is where you can kind of go back and see, sadly, what was excluded, but also put together a much fuller picture of
Right.
what it
Yeah,
was.
I'm not, yeah, and I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm just saying that I think that there's room, like a lot of in punk rock, there isn't room for the, I don't want to say this fancy word that I learned in fancy college recently, but critique, like it's okay to have conversations about talking about what's missing along with talking about what got shown. And it's okay. It's just it's a conversation to have, and it's not an attack on either of those people who I think are amazing human beings. And congratulations on your recent Fat Mike episode that just came out.
Oh, that was
I
an
don't know
old
if
one.
you're airing mine, but
No, that was actually the first time I met Mike. If you go through, they've gotten a little more heated, as that's
yeah,
what very glowing. I'm very like
yeah,
revelatory of Mike at that point. But I think as it's gone on, like, and I love Mike, and I certainly I love Ian. I love both these guys, and I think they have done, well, they shaped who I am ideologically. Like, they wrote different books of the Bible to me, basically, with the
sure.
records they put out, and the stuff they were involved in, and all these various books. It's a big Bible that I'm reading. But at the same time, like you're saying, like, I think the fact that we can critique these people and can critique this stuff is what makes punk special, that it is this sort of living
Mhm.
organic thing that is open to reassessment and is open
Right, right,
to yeah,
right.
restructuring.
Sure. Yeah. And even in listening to like, if you just kind of think about the sound biting of Mike, and like I always listen to his interviews and I'm just like, God, how are we going to compete with the idea of a butt plug going through TSA? And, that story is just so incredible, right? But then, there's another like very rebellion, like that might be his personal rebellion, like his expression of like what makes him unique in that extreme. But we could also look at Ian, who would not have a butt plug going through TSA, but is also unique in his extremes of like, like his founding of his personality and those stories of like that kind of rebellion. So it's, if you look at it, it's like not the story, it's like that energy under the story, right? It's like that. And it can be, and that's kind of the message, I think, of like punk in the personal life of people, is that, it may not be your story. There may be seven people in a room and two of them only go on to do something interesting that you and I had talked about earlier that maybe we can elaborate, because it was like a conversation from before. But those other folks, that those people went on to go do interesting things probably in their lives too. They're just not documented. They're not going to be having talking about it on a podcast. But there's so much like revolution and like raising your kids and how you work and what you buy and like what you do in this world, that's interesting too to me. Our fans of punk rock are way more interesting than the people that are on stage. Way more interesting.
Well, I think the thing that I loved about punk rock, and I think even at that first Warp Tour, I know being on that Warp Tour probably felt very different, but is that there was this idea that it was a breaking down of who was on stage and who was in the crowd. And
That was the Sex Pistols. That started with Sex Pistols, don't you think?
I think it even probably starts before that. Like I look at like I wonder I don't know. I've never seen footage of the Fugs playing, but I imagine bands like the Fugs or I look at the thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is like the thing that I think is a sonic precursor to punk in a lot of ways are bands like the Imperial Dogs or Zolar X or the stuff that was happening in kind of Los Angeles area prior to punk. Because I think that to me is like a direct precursor of
Right,
this
right.
sonically. And
Yeah. Well,
and I'm
Sonic,
fascinated by that stuff.
I think that in the United States, this is this is my kind of first draft on this. So like this, bring your sociologist to cut me down and argue. I'm totally ready. But there's this idea that in the 60s we did start to have garage rock. So sonically, we're talking about a type of music kind of came out of both Detroit and Los Angeles. And why? Because I think the automobile dictated the garage, and the garage dictated private space where you could be loud and it more experimental. And a lot and bands came out of this as their like true musical expression. And there's a lot of them, but we can look at maybe like compilations like Nuggets and stuff like that to go look at them. But I think that what ended up happening was, at least for the US, we went into the Vietnam War, and it took a lot of our musicians at that time with it. And people came back traumatized. Society was traumatized and wanting to be normalized. So a lot of people put down their instruments, didn't follow through with their stuff. So then that could be picked up like later. The UK had a similar experience, with the fall of colonialism, right? And what they called pub rock, which I can't even scare up an example right now, but the
Oh,
Stranglers
Dr.
came from.
Feelgood and like
Right. Yeah.
Grizzly Schwartz
Pub
and
rock.
yeah.
Yeah. So it was like a similar experience, but I think pub rock stayed strong. Like there were still people playing all the way up through, let's say, I mean, I consider like maybe The Damned to be one of the first um, singles that would really call itself punk, that with the PR was punk, the public relations was punk,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. I think that's fascinating what you're saying too about the garage rock idea and like the way that it's not geography, I guess like architecture or industry dictates this music. And it does feel like, and it certainly does come out of garage rock. And I think Los Angeles in particular, like another thing that I think added to the trauma that you kind of talked about with Vietnam was the Manson thing and how much that comes up on this show
Oh,
post
interesting.
post Manson. Like there's almost like a fear of youth culture for a long time, and
Mhm.
a palpable kind of like what are these kids going to do? And obviously that tying with the Vietnam War and the escalation with that and more kids getting drafted over and losing kids like you're saying, and it just feels like there's almost a lost generation, particularly in Los Angeles, of youth culture. So when punk comes in, and once again in Los Angeles especially, there's a fear of this sort of thing that where
Mhm.
it's like the energy of this thing that is just rearing its head again, which is, I guess, youthful expression and punk, especially because anyone could participate in it. Anyone could be involved in this thing, no matter where you came from.
Right, right. Yeah. For Los Angeles too, I think the little bit like I mean, I wasn't there. Thankfully, I'm not that old. I mean, uh yeah, I think that there was the first expressions of punk rock in Los Angeles when we're talking about like Alice Bag and the Germs, and we're really talking about early, and how they were really influenced by it really was media that came over. And I'm going to say it was fashion media that came over. And LA was such a unique kind of like expression of it because they weren't about the designer designing punk. They were about thrift storing. They were about like really creating from the environment. Like Los Angeles was as far west as you could go for the American dream. And it felt like that I think, and I maybe people at that time, but they could satirize this idea and do parody around like the Manson family. Like it became kitschy at a certain point, and nostalgia for the 60s to kind of like point to it as an expression of like why it was so messed up, and why like the grand narrative of like you get you grow up and get married and like get educated and move to the suburbs and raise your kids and like you get two cars and like you get a garage and like you get this stuff, these rewards for becoming middle class, and how that was just completely broken down and then satirized. And I think that a lot of the early punks, I'm just going to say, I know that there are all these stories about, I ran away from home at 16, but there's a lot of like focused education and like those people could talk about it. Like that thing about, we always talk about UK punk rock, right? Everyone met at art school in 1976. There wasn't one person that didn't meet at art school. So that meant they had to go get into a school. They had to create a portfolio. Dave Vanian's just like, I don't know. I was doing art. And then these guys said I needed to be singing in a band. And I was like, okay. And like all the class are like, yeah, we all met at art school. There's like this kind of thing where I think like it wasn't just an accident of expression. I think people kind of knew what they were doing, pushing out their opinions and their creativity.
I think it was certainly very contrived at certain points in certain
Mhm.
scenes, but I think there's other ones where it does almost feel a little weirdly spontaneous or just like weird convergences of things to happen. And I think Los Angeles, especially, I think also Los Angeles is the first birthplace of sort of the punk rock kid because you look at
Yeah, yeah,
England,
yeah.
you've got like a lot of people meeting in college. You have a lot of people in, certainly New York were older. Whereas in LA, it's all kids at these shows and kids making up some of these bands, these first bands.
Right. And
Um,
and then like that one of my theories on like early punk rock in Los Angeles is that these young people came in the late 70s. Like you can talk about that first wave, the first 100 in Los Angeles. But then like 1981, everyone complains, oh, the shows, they got, all these suburban kids came in. And that was my generation. Thank you. I was one of those suburban kids that came in and lit fires in bathrooms. And ripped fucking toilets out of the wall. I'm just going to tell you. So yes. But also a lot of it was, those kids that were 16 and 76 were now getting older and they were thinking about career and getting married and leaving the punk scene to go have careers in film and all these other things that they did. And yes, they were getting pushed out. And yeah, people were worming at the Fleetwood or, whatever the blah, blah, blah people talk about.
but and I think that's amazing because that sets a precedence for where punk goes and how it's always like that. Like it's your scene. And then there comes a point where you have to become not post punk the genre, but post punk as an adult. That doesn't mean you have to leave the scene or leave the values or stop going to shows or anything, but just surrender the zeitgeist to another generation. And it might not look like what you want punk to look like.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
might
yeah,
not
yeah,
be your
yeah.
punk, right? But it's
Punk
good.
punk sacrifices itself at the altar of the mainstream every 10 years and then reemerges as a different expression. And it has to,
Mhm. And I feel
you
like
know?
in Los Angeles, it's fascinating at a certain point from what people have told me, what obviously has been written about in books now and storied, is that the violence just becomes too much and it just sort of seems like it implodes. And I guess there's also the draw of metal that's happening and there's an exodus of the scene. But it doesn't die. It just goes underground. Like there's still your future bandmate in Chain of Strength. There's still like people doing hardcore and punk, right? Like there's future Justice League. I guess he was playing in by back then. It just it's just underground. It goes back to smaller venues. It just you're saying it just reiterates itself because it won't die. It's just like now that kids have a name for this thing that you were talking about earlier with Patti Smith and Yoko Ono being the precursors to. Now that it's named and we have it as a defined thing, it's never going to die. It's just going to change shapes and
Sure.
find a new hole to live in.
Yeah. But yeah, I think one of the concerns though is this idea of where we originally like the obsession with documenting self that I think my generation has, I think is really a disservice, not to what's going on in punk right now, but definitely 10 years from now. This idea that you could be in trash talk and like Cat Williams is doing shorts in your audience. If that was even real. I just saw
That's
this.
real. That's 100% real.
Oh my God.
Suge Knight was there too. They that
But
gets
look,
leaved out of the video.
that that's the thing. The questioning now of what is real and what's not real in the simulation of culture.
But that's why this is important because this is real. And everyone, like, we get hit up sometimes for people to come on this podcast, and I'll be like, let me research it for a second. And you can look in to anyone's kind of like pedigree being involved in this music. You can hit up friends from a given city. You can be like, what's the deal with this band? What's the deal with this artist?
Mhm.
And we're all connected. And that's the thing that I think is amazing, is that it is like this living organism that keeps growing. But
Yes, we are all connected. But what about 10 years from now when we start experiencing, AI being
mm,
able to not generate, but being able to, where, like, don't you ever just wake up and you're like, "God, I need a new band, but why can't the algorithm give me that?" Like,
yeah,
I'm frustrated with it. Like, people think, oh, the algorithm's telling me how to like me. I'm like, no, I need, it's not good enough yet,
because the
but it
one,
will be.
well, I'm sorry, let me cut you off there. The one thing the algorithm will never be better than us with is a sweaty show. Like this, the algorithm, until that, maybe the virtual reality bodysuit will finally like kill DIY hardcore or punk rock, because until you can, and COVID certainly put it on the ropes for a while, but until you find a way to get rid of the idea of going to an environment and feeling this sort of shared expression with a bunch of people that are excited about generating their own culture, that's the thing I think that's magical about this thing, and that's the thing that will never hopefully die. And you do see it. There's new bands, and I think the people that are going to be influenced by this next wave of bands that are hopefully blowing up now are going to be inspired to do this thing, and it's going to, I don't know, but I'm an extremist, obviously, with my views on this genre.
No, no, I totally think that like that is, the hope of community connection and the feeling of connection. Um, the sweaty show. There might have to be at some point that might not exist. I'm not trying to be a
No,
fatalist.
I know, and I get it, and
I'm
I
just
think,
saying it might
yeah,
not exist. And that's what I'm talking. I'm not talking about today. I think kids today are on it. I think kids today are on it. Like this alpha generation, like 14-year-olds right now, and like what they're amazing. They
yeah.
truly are. Like I am not worried. It's more about what is how they are going to be impacted by post-capitalism, marketing, like the pressures that they're going to have of their conformity and maybe their kids, whatever. That's
Oh, it's
just like,
terrifying. It's terrifying. Like raising
it's
kids
not
right now. Oh no, it
terrifying.
is. It is. It
It's
is.
just something that needs to be talked about.
I wake up every morning scared. I wake up every
No,
morning.
but that's because you're being informed by algorithms to be scared.
No, I'm more scared of the fact that I've got three kids and I pin my hopes and dreams on positive pitchfork reviews. Like there's really not a lot to be positive about now.
Yeah, but
Uh,
your kids are going to be so much more,
oh,
like
they
that's
already
the
are.
like
They are. I look at them
there's
now.
so much more than like, I don't know. People always come up to me and they're like, "What advice would you give my 14-year-old who wants to be in a band?" I'm just like, don't listen to anyone over 23 years old giving you advice. Do not.
Yeah.
We we're just going to exploit you ultimately. So don't listen to us.
Well, and I think that is the biggest threat to youth culture now, is that you don't have things that have time to develop, because as soon as something gets any sort of traction, it just becomes part of or just gets, sucked, assumed into whatever is going to be the wood chipper that hopefully you make it out of in one piece. So you don't really have the fostering and sort of building of communities like you used to. It's more just like individual artists now, which is, it never, they're never going to build anything out of one artist. You need sort of like, the whole anti club.
That's as long as if we're holding the artist as like that is our pinpoint,
Mm-hmm.
if we're holding that, if we start thinking about community moving forward, maybe that could be different because we're in different like various communities on the internet and in our connections. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of social media, but I accept it for what it is to be able to look at it and figure it out. And I think that, you know, I don't even know anyone in my life right now. I don't know a 14-year-old that even wants to interact with their phone. they're just burnt out on it by 14. So it's like an interesting thing to watch.
I would love my 14-year-old to get burnt out on his phone a little bit more, but it has not happened yet. But you're right. They
Yeah.
they don't want to put themselves out there in the way that certainly
I
our
did.
generation, yeah, our
Oh man,
generation
I was
did, and
hoping
like,
for a phone. Are you kidding? I mean, I was a
oh,
photographer. I couldn't stop documenting. Like I'm part of that. Like I was a photographer from the second I could get into shows, I was taking a camera, so like I was really part of that. Like, don't look at me. I'm here to look at you, kind
you.
of like mentality. And I feel like that's what rolled it out.
I was trying to look at some of your photos today, and I feel like you have the most under uh exploited is the most negative way to put it, but I thought maybe like brought out to the world or shown archive of unbelievable music shit. It's crazy the stuff that you were obviously a part of, but
Hmm.
prior to that, therefore, and then just with the camera snapping these snapshots. Like I would love to see more. The stuff that I've seen is
Bro,
incredible.
I get caught up in the conversations though. Like a lot of those people, like yeah, I have musicians, but I also like the stuff that I love is I took photographs of other 14, 15, 16-year-olds at the time. And at the time, what we were into was not what 14, 15, and 16-year-olds were into. So there's a lot of like thought about permission and storytelling and like who gets to tell the story. So I'm all about that. So a lot of the stuff I don't show. It's like it's still a conversation for me to figure out.
I think it's interesting too because you're right, it does serve, especially with the people that are involved in music that are doing this stuff,
Hmm.
it does serve it's a historical importance or whatever that kind of side of things. But then you're right, there's another side that continues the romanticism of it. And I
Right.
think I don't know about yourself and certainly the people around you at the time, but other people have been on the show talked about Johnny Thunders, and I have friends that were started doing heroin because Johnny Thunders did it. Like there's still that sort of punk rock. Oh, this is bad, and we shouldn't do it, and we know how the story ends for every single person we worship. But there's also the
Hmm.
idea that like you want to try it, you want to do it,
Hmm.
and it's yeah, it just you
Yeah,
don't want
yeah,
to
that
further that.
really that it gets complicated in that sense because we're really talking about some heartbreak and devastating kind of experiences. And it's not just like, woo, the we were so crazy back then kind of conversations. And like, well, again, I was just on a panel recently with Flea, who I've known forever, completely, such a different genre, but started in LA punk rock and part of a lot of this. He was like one of those first people when I was super young. People would say, "Well, what do you listen to?" And I'm like, "Alice Coltrane." You know what I mean? And they'd be
Yeah,
like, "No way!" Like that's what I listen to. You one of those, first people. And gotta have some really good no means no stories. Where are they from? Toronto or
no,
Vancouver?
Victoria, but they are one of the
Yeah,
greatest
God,
bands
okay.
ever. Well, my,
Yeah.
my first show was actually going to go see. I went to a No Means No Ultra Bidet Alice Donut show, and someone spat on the lead singer of Alice Donut, and he jumped in the crowd and tried to beat the
We were
crap
so
out of that.
crazy back then.
Yeah,
Okay, so Flea and I were on a panel, and it was one of those like, tell your punk rock stories. And by the way, awesome genre. So everyone was telling that we were so crazy. We stayed up all night. We did this. We did that today. And Flea and I were just, Michael and I were like sitting there going, dude, I was 15 doing heroin with adults. Do you want to hear that story? And like, we're just like, how do you unpack that to an audience that just wants to hear about how great punk rock was? Like, how do you get into the shade and the nuance? And, he and I are just like, what are we going to do? And we're like, let's not, it's not the time or place like right now. And we're like, well, let's just tell a story about seeing you the first time you were in Fear. When you played in Fear, like Keith Morris jumped up and and he's like, yeah, that's a good one, but we both couldn't tell it because we were so shaken by the circumstances that really drove those situations,
hmm
and like, okay, we're gonna be okay. Right. So that was like one thing. What else were we talking about? Oh, violence in shows. Yeah, violence in shows is what singles out people that can't handle the violence in shows. And that's an expression that happens. That's happening in LA right now. Like the shows are hyper violent. So it's just like people are like, I'm not gonna go to that. My knee hurts, and I'm like, yeah, you're risking it. You're risking it because it is like pro wrestling. It's the same thing as pro wrestling. It's where men get to go to express self-harm with each other.
And I think Nicole Panter described it as people with trauma inflicting trauma on other people so they can inflict trauma on other people. Like it really is a place where, and it you see it time and time again with like hardcore and punk where people get to it and people come with some baggage. And sadly, as positive as a place it is, like you're saying, it's a place where there's a lot of terrible shit that
Yeah, yeah,
happened. And so it
yeah.
still happens, I'm sure. Like,
Yeah, it's terrible shit that's how do you say it when groups like you may not do that outside of the group, but you're totally okay with doing it in the group, if that makes sense.
yeah, like I guess,
There's a word for it, but
yeah,
Nicole would know, probably.
yeah, shoot. But it is, you're right. Like there's like sort of a group think or a safety in, and it's interesting because like in punk, we're all coming here because we're rejecting society, but yet we still reestablish the structures of society within punk where there's a hierarchy and there's sort of this idea of all
The
the cool
fittest.
kids. Yeah, the not yeah, and
The
it's
fittest is reflected in violence.
hmm
Just
hmm
saying. I mean, the fittest of them. And I love photographing that experience. So like I'm in on that's one of my favorite male experiences are one of my favorite. Like if I could actually tolerate wartime journalism, I would go do it. But I can't, like I feel too tender, to be able to really look at like true pain and suffering. But I think that like it's mimicking this like, pain and suffering and hyperviolence and who gets to be on top and then also who cares for the other. There's another like aspect which I call I fell down in the pit, or as I like to say, Sepultura is the safest pit around. Like you just like I have videos of me going into the pit and everyone just helps you up because
yeah,
everyone's older, right?
yeah. It's interesting because
Cardio. It's just it ends up being cardio if you're over 21.
it shows up and it spreads from LA, right? There's like the story that Rollins tells in American Hardcore is that they went out to LA, they saw people dancing like that, they brought it back to Washington, and then it sort of like spreads throughout Boston to New York and all this sort of thing where it is it's something very bizarre and like trying to explain it to someone who has never had involvement in it, like why do people do it? Like why do people tolerate it?
Oh my God. I love this conversation. Do you want some possible explanations?
I love it. Yeah, please.
Well, first off, it's always been an expression as far as we can tell in culture. I mean, new information is always coming in, but it's always been an expression. But I just read this really great book on Wagner, who classical guy from the late 1800s. In the late 1800s, a lot of stuff was changing in society. For instance, we got electricity. So he was this guy that started to realize that instead of like doing shows in the daytime, he wanted to do shows in the nighttime using electricity to illuminate the stage. This idea that it is a stage, and this idea that you have people in your audience, and people would go to Wagner shows, hear his music, dun 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 dun, dun and just start punching each other. And this is in the late 1800s.
Yeah.
Police were called in to clear out the shows. He eventually had to build his own theater because nobody would let him come into their theaters to be able to do it. And it just sounds like we've been cycling through that same kind of thing. People were ripping the seats out and throwing them into the streets.
Yeah. I think there's like
But when you think you're unique, you're not.
no, you're right, and it's safe. It's like a horror movie or a haunted house. It's like a safe violence where you know it's going to be violent, and there's certainly been people that have been really hurt, but there is, like you're saying, there's sort of safety that people are going to look out for you, and no one's going to take it to a level that they wouldn't want to be inflicted upon
Mm,
them theoretically.
yeah, but and then theoretically, I mean, with the experience that we started to see in the mid 80s in Los Angeles, a lot of hyperviolence, a lot of people that would show up at shows with more of the intention of violence and not so much the intention of being a fan, which is exactly what happened to Wagner.
Mm.
People started to show up to be violent. And Fat Mike and I have a very similar story. Like we were at one of the same shows at the Music Machine in West Los Angeles to see Suicidal, and both of us had really violent experiences separately. And we both were like, we're out of here, we're moving to San Francisco, which is considered more of a less, you know what I mean, more inclusive kind of scene, different expressions, like outside of that expression. And we both went to San Francisco State. I tried, I dropped out. He was able to get through it, but
Well, yeah, and it feels like that happened to. There's like a fleeing that kind of happens out of that scene at a certain point because it just does get like people are getting.
mhm.
That's almost like separate violence. I don't know. I don't mean to say this. I'm like talking like I was there, but to me, it seems like it's separate violence than the punk rock violence that we're talking about. Like we're talking about gang involved people in some cases. We're talking about, like you're saying, people that are coming there looking for violence. I'm sure people with mental health issues that are coming there just to fuck people up. Like it's not necessarily, certainly far, far from the first 100 like you talked about, but I think it's even far away from just like the idea of the mosh pit violence and going in there and doing the worm or skanking or doing
Blowing off
the
steam.
HB strut. Yeah, like that's a different kind of violence than people getting stabbed and horrific
Mhm, mhm.
shit.
Yeah, and that like, it's interesting to think about like a criminal element that's starting to like move through the scene also, particularly like shows and laundering drug money and other kind of like where I get it's just the kind of thing that shows up. And like it was the same thing in Austria and Germany in the late what it became Austria and Germany in the late 1800s, and people started leaving to go to France. They started leaving to go to Switzerland. And it's kind of that same migration, that same idea. Because then in like France, you're like, noisy outsiders of the late 1800s would have been like Eric Satie and then like the Dadaist movement and all these people that came in, that were like, no, art is about tearing up newspapers and putting it on canvas, like, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
like no, it's not about a mainstream salon. No, where people would officially have to go to be artists or schools. It was like, no, that's all,
Like not to say that this is like, oh, it's all worth it, but at the same time it does inspire and create, like you're saying, other forms of art or makes people go different directions. You hear it talked about, I guess, most famously in punk in DC, where you have that revolution summer where people have a reaction to how violent the scene got and start taking the music in a different direction. And you certainly see it in other scenes kind of play out. ABC No Rio in New York, and it feels like, once again, this is kind of part of that natural life cycle of a scene where you get to an age where you're like, why am I doing this? Or this is not what I signed up for, and you got to figure out what's next.
right. Or you just have to think these late 80s sweet hardcore guys that were like maybe like 19, 20, 21. Like I don't know, Judge and Underdog, and I feel like they're coming out and playing shows and excited for these shows, and then this barrage of like people show up that they don't know who they are, that are just like enacting violence, certain opinions about race and culture, like making sure they exclude other people, and these bands are just like, what's happening? Like, why is this happening?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's, once again, like you have, well, I think Danita talked about when she was on the show, like that's the rise of sort of LA having this more arty punk scene and people at the anti club and taking it in a different direction, like trying to get away from whatever the other shit is that's happening. And it is, and it does, like, it never goes away though, right? And it just sort of gets ready
Mhm.
for this next sort of huge flare up that kind of happens in Los
Right,
Angeles
right,
where
right,
it
right,
gets
right.
maybe
Right,
bigger
right,
than ever.
right. Because we can talk about like simultaneously, we were talking about Savage Republic and we were
Hmm.
people going out to the desert and blowing stuff up, which again, another problem. Please, but whatever. It's like, but having these other experiences that aren't that are outside of that might be slightly more inclusive, another art punk scenes and
Well, you brought up Savage Republic.
queer scene coming up. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And like, and that's, and I think, like you said earlier, it's not like this stuff is new to punk rock. Like women in
Mhm.
punk rock isn't something that's new when Riot Girl happens. Like the media seems to kind of portray it like or queer people in punk rock. Like going back to Jane County's like the first ever New York punk rocker, and she's like what 74. She's doing these recordings like Trouble at the Cup and stuff. Like she's not Trouble at the Cup or whatever the record's called. Sorry, but she's
No, no,
like
no, no. There were tons of women breaking it off in the late 70s in New York or in urban areas. I mean, we're not shy. We're not short of that. I think that we like look at the lineages of growth, right? Because we're human beings and we need to simplify what's happening. So it's very hard to hold the space that there were multiple scenes happening at the same time
mhm,
that would move forward to be an influence, right? I mean, when I went to shows in 80, 81, there was no lack of camaraderie among women. There were plenty of bands, plenty of artists. Joanna Went, one of my favorite artists to talk about of all time, performance artists that would come into the punk clubs and do like hit a tape recorder and do these just extraordinary performances. But one of the things that like to think about in that time, we're talking late 70s, early 80s, I think that the guys were more out to be like, I love this lifestyle and I want to figure out how I can capitalize on it. So we need to make t-shirts, books, video, and records. Where the women were more like, I love this moment, and this when this moment ends, it ends. So now we don't have a lot of documentation or representation of tangible stuff that they did. We only have the memories of what they did. And that's no one wants that because how are you going to sell it? You
mhm,
can't sell it.
mhm.
So it becomes not as important. Those women's expressions become not as important. I think Yoko Ono faced that. Like when we finally get to see like people are releasing video of her performances from the fucking 70s. You know what I mean? You're
Yeah.
just like, whoa, how is this happening? These amazing performances. And we're only getting them now.
Yeah, I feel like 100%. Like I think Castration Squad. That's another band that I had no real idea about till doing this podcast and now researching it and finding out. Well, they played a lot of shows. They were like
They played a lot of shows. They were really supporters of the scene. They were also promoters of the scene. They were flyer makers. They were artists. And in that band was Tracy, who was also in Red Cross. Shannon, who I don't know how many other, I think her focus was Castration Squad. And then
Alice Bag was in it for a second too,
Alice
right?
Beck was not in it for a second. She
The
was
whole
in
time.
it
Yeah.
for a while, and then Patricia Morrison, Patricia Bagg, I think also moved in and out, but she, went into Gun Club, who are a great band. I always want to, prop them up for bands that were like, hey, we're punk rock, but doing something kind of extraordinary. No one's going to get it, and we're never going to be appreciated. And then she went on, to be in The Damned.
And Sisters of Mercy too. Her journey through punk is
Right.
wild. Like it's but and Alice wasn't someone from the Pandoras also in Castration Squad too or something or I don't
I
know.
went, no. I have photographed Castration Squad. They're one of my favorite bands with Alice, with Patricia might have just been on stage. Christian Death, they were like a band, but they also had, they were performance. So a lot of people were on stage. Again, who's the audience? Who's the performer? And they had Eva O from the Speed Queens, and Eva O was very much like a forefront in the scene with, yeah,
Well,
help
the
me out
Screamers
there.
too. The Screamers are like another band that there's no official recordings ever, but they might be the most important first wave Los Angeles band from what people describe them as, and just
Yeah.
certainly the stuff that has come out is hugely influential, and that's with nothing official.
Yeah. They were also one of the first bands that really from LA, from the scene. So I was still little, but they would talk, they'd be in the media talking about touring.
Mhm.
Like, oh, you can tour from that. You know what I mean? And like this expression and dance and performance. And
Mhm.
again, how are we going to capitalize on it? We're really about into the sweaty show.
I find like
What
it,
you're into, what you're into, they were into, so then there
yeah.
wasn't always, I think, what is of the Screamers? There's a demo and like maybe Target Video.
Well, I think now people have taken all the bootleg demos that have been circulating. They might be one of the most bootleg punk bands ever. Like I can think of at least five bootlegs I have in my collection. But I think
Okay.
now it's been officially released. There's also, I think, a Target video of like a TV kind of performance of them playing on a sound stage that was like officially released at some point.
Hmm.
But that's it, right? Like it's very underdocumented. And I think that's the thing that I've also found fascinating is like what writes the history, where certain bands are talked
Ooh,
about
right.
in a,
History.
yeah, exactly. Like I think there's punk it's better because there's so many primary sources and zines that you can kind of go back to and get a better picture than what records are out there. But like years after the fact, the records you gravitate to only to find out like no, they weren't really part of the scene. They were like a periphery band at best, and not it wasn't that. It wasn't that. It was this band that never recorded anything.
Right, right, right.
Like
Yeah,
certainly
for
that
sure.
was some bands.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like who gets to write the history? We're talking about, living in a society based on capital, being able to raise the money to be able to create the document,
Hmm.
right? Create the zine, create the recording, create the t-shirt.
Well, and I think punk is the place where that stuff became, and I think technology reached that point, but that became accessible to people with not necessarily as much means because you could make a tape, you could photocopy your zine, you didn't have to publish a magazine anymore. And I think that didn't level the playing field completely, but certainly brought it down to a much more accessible level, and certainly why kids, I guess, produced a lot of the media back then.
Right, right, right. The cassette tape.
Did record a tape? That was a
Yeah, there's recordings. Yeah.
what was the vibe of that band? Like, is it like Savage Republic, or like obviously that's later in their academic careers, I imagine.
Right. So when I had some friends who later, Ethan Port, who later went on to be in Savage Republic, and local West LA band, he was sounds associated with the Rim Pests. I mean, there were a couple like deep demo only West LA bands that were associated. We had a record store in West Los Angeles called Rhino Records, which was on Westwood Boulevard. So we were kind of like on top of it. And later had a store called Texas Records. West LA was still considered like a place you could go to live at the time, be able to start a record store, be able to start an art gallery. We had a coffee shop called Radion that was one of the kind of the first 50s themed, kitschy, weirdo kind of proto-punk coffee shops also.
Okay.
So we had these places to go meet, but we also had UCLA and UCLA art department. So kind of came out of that. I was 14 or 15 when I was in but the idea was to go into parking structures, attract audience just based on whoever was in the parking structure at the time and play music that was unwritten, impromptu sounds, create the sounds of industrial automobile stuff. I mean, Kraftwerk's one of my all-time favorite bands, really, so it's like a very natural, like, the idea that you didn't have to sit down to learn guitar or learn music was an entry point for me into performance and music. I
So
mean, the only time I really ever really, really, really had to sit down and learn songs, I was in a band with Courtney Love and Cat Bjelland. Courtney Love who went on to Hole and then married Kurt Cobain, and Cat Bjelland who went on to a band called Babes in Toyland, all kind of late 80s, 90s bands. And the discussions of being in a band were, I came from hardcore and loved Black Flag, but I also at the same time, loved Kraftwerk, and at the same time loved the idea of like, why would we write a song? Everybody writes songs. Why would we do that? Like, I mean, and I look back to little me. Little me was a genius, like a genius about that stuff. And it really wasn't until like I listened to Cat Bjelland's songwriting and Courtney's lyrics that I was really like, "Oh, I guess there is something to it. There is something to maybe learning it as a craft. Because both of those two ladies were amazing at the craft of storytelling, the craft of expression, like being able to create lyrical stories that made sense and music that was under it that like supported those stories. And I was like, and they all needed a bass player. Bass sucks. I hate bass. I hate rock bass. It's just like I play it like I go get ready. Even to this day in L7, I'm just like, bass. I have to go play bass. Do you know what I mean? Like basic. It's in the name. I mean,
Oh,
like bass is so much more interesting in other genres, right?
it does play a role though in punk because it allows the guitar to not have to be, I guess, as rhythmic too, right? Like the bass is such a, I don't know. I feel like
Don't defend the
I
bass.
know I feel bad.
Not in punk. There's other places to defend the bass. Okay. But not in punk. Because like remember what I was talking about my early influences,
Yeah,
unless it's just someone playing guitar, we're talking about the rhythm of bass driving that, that sonically that's driving with vocals on top. Guitar is just like a little thing that pops in once in a while.
yeah. Because but like going back,
Sonically.
what you talked about being influenced by Black Flag,
I
like
grew
from
up on
Chuck.
the meters. I grew up
Yeah,
on the meters. I mean, like those were the song. Like when I was like, I have to learn songs. I learned meters songs. Like bass. They were bass driven songs.
I feel bad for Dee Dee now and Chuck from Black Flag. I feel like you've diminished their roles in these bands.
I know. I mean, look, it's like honestly, like Dee Dee's great, but he's a vibe. He's Dee Dee.
Yeah, yeah.
It isn't about the. It's not really about the play. Like, what? I'm sorry. And let's just have another conversation. I think that people forget that, like, Kira Rossler in Black Flag brought Black Flag to the next level. And she was in Black Flag very early on. You're the music nerd. When did she join Black Flag? Like 82 or something?
Is it the
83?
80, 83, 84?
Yeah, like a
Yeah.
major portion of Black Flag, they were a mixed band.
Hmm. Hmm. And well, we can't. The Rossler family in general, I feel like her and her brother are both like all those like Twisted Roots and Tater Tots. I think was there's just so much fascinating stuff in that.
Well,
But
he was in the Screamers. You know that, right? Paul Rossler was in
that's
the
right. He's
Screamers.
in Screamers too, of course. Like
Right.
not to.
So, yeah, I have like really great. Okay. So, like, as a musician, I'm trying to be a good musician. I try to believe that if you're good at anything you do, you educate yourself in it. Like, you always go with an open mind and like revisit and take music lessons. And you're talking about Greg Hetson from the Circle Jerks.
Hmm.
Really early on, when I was like, why do we need to practice or play or do anything like this? Greg Hetson looked at me and he goes, I take at least 20 music lessons a year, at least. And I'm
Damn.
like, I'm doing the math, right? I'm doing the math. I'm like, the cost, like everything, the time, the cost, like who does he go to? But I've really taken that to heart and I try to do as many music lessons as I can a year. And Paul Rossler is my piano teacher.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh,
I
that's
know,
really
talk
cool.
about spoiled, privileged. Uh, ah, I'm white man in it, my friend.
Lucky.
Spoiled, privileged. I'm just like, who can give me? And he is an incredible musician. Like
Oh,
not just like he was in the Screamers, but musicality is incredible.
oh, absolutely. Hey everyone, now that the holidays are over, Factor's ready to eat meal delivery has got your resolutions covered. Factor takes the stress out of meal planning, so you get to skip the grocery stores, the prep work, and the cooking fatigue because they have 35 chef crafted options each week. So whether you want to try going veggie or vegan like myself, whether you're like one of my kids trying to eat anything and everything that you can find, whether you're trying to go keto or calorie wise, they've got you. And there's 55 add-ons that you can also put on there. So you'll have tons of nutritious and flavorful options. Whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, Factor's meals are ready in 2 minutes, and there's snack options as well, and juices and smoothies and all sorts of things. It's been amazing having Factor in the house because whether it's meals for myself or, as I said, meals for my kids, I don't have to do overpriced takeout anymore. There's delicious food that's available right down there in our refrigerator. And it was all delivered right to my door. And it was great for me having some of these vegan meals in the house because there was no stress for me. There was no cooking, no cleanup after I'd made food for the kids. I could just pop down, grab one of these, and it's ready in 2 minutes. Or if the kids were hungry, I'd send them down and get they could get one of the meat options, and once again, it's ready in 2 minutes. And you don't have to just take my word for it. You can head over to factormeals.com/TOAP50 and use the code TOAP50 to get 50% off your Factor meals. That code again is TOAP50 at factormeals.com/TOAP50 to get that 50% off and see for yourself. Delicious, nutritious. And I get the kids on the podcast, but they don't feel like coming on to do the ads. I got to pay them. And, oh my God, that gets messy. Well, and
Yeah.
you brought up Sugar Baby Doll, and I got to ask you about that band because, like, the fact that the three of you going on to what you did in music were all in a band together to me is just so awesome.
Isn't it awesome?
It's cool. It's so sick. It's just like once again, it's further testimony to punk rock being this place which brings people together that have this drive that wind up doing things later in life, and it's yeah. So what was the? Because I've heard the recordings that came later when they became, I think, Pagan Babies, and it's
Hmm.
kind of dream poppy vibe. Was that was like early on when you were playing with them?
So, no, I think that it was a little bit more, I think that the Dream Poppy vibe was where they were going. And in the moment of like 1986, I had gone to do some time in Europe, and I stayed in Amsterdam, and that's where I met guys that later would be in the Obsessed and a lot of like more of like the squatter punk expressions of the late 80s. And Guy, who was in the Obsessed and still runs labels to this day, was just like, you got to go play harder music. Like, these gals are great. Like, I played him the demo and he's like, no, this is good, but its trajectory is commercial. And I had lots of conversations about wanting to work on the outside. I felt like I was in Sugar Babylon for as a support role. I sometimes will end up being the glue in a band or the rudder that keeps the crazy people stable. And when I say crazy, I'm saying like the people with a lot of ideas that, to like really help with follow through and help with taking, like, somebody has an idea for a song and like asking them, well, where does this song going to live in a year? If it's on stage, then we need to move in that direction. If
Yeah,
it's on a recording, we need to move in that direction. Um, and he was just like, and also there were drug problems in the band, and there was like, so there was personal stuff going on. I mean, a lot of that, I always say with Courtney and with Kat, these were, and myself, because I was using it at the same time, but I love the idea that I got to be really out of body with it. There were no words to describe how we were, how we thought about things, how we experienced the world emotionally, or how we experienced like this stuff. So it came out really like the best you can call us were like bitches are difficult, and so a lot of self-medication came in. And Courtney loves writing a book right now, and I'm just praying that she covers this stuff because I think it's going to be like so valuable instead of just the, what I mean, obvious stuff that the pop culture narrative canon that people want to hear, and like create the villain of her that they need to be able to explain what happened. I hope that she can really talk about, that experience of what it's like to maybe have ADHD or Asperger's or like mental health challenges like in that era, and how it comes out in like expression and music and art and whatnot. Yeah, so that was what was happening. So then I was just like, at the same time, people were telling me there's a band in L7 in LA. They're like a meat and potatoes rock band. They're doing, garage, but in like a really interesting way. And, that just ended up kind of being what I wanted to do. So I came home, packed my stuff up from San Francisco and moved back down to LA. I was like, I'm here.
what
Come
was
on.
well, you brought it up there too, which the uh the idea that people like self-medicate, and especially ADHD. And I think now we're moving into a period. I think one of the positive things from social media that I found, how many people self-diagnosed for ADHD and then went and got an actual diagnosis after realizing they had it because they saw a TikTok video about it or something.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
feel like that is so many people I know that wound up getting into drugs and fucking up on drugs.
Hmm.
That is
Being
probably
being
something.
told like not having those academic successes in a
Hmm.
system that doesn't accommodate you to begin with. I feel like I was very much like when I went to the middle school, which for the US is like your, I don't know, seventh grade, your sort of 13 to 16 age range. I was in, very specifically in a school that wanted to make sure that working class people were successful. So you had like choices between like kind of emphasizing auto mechanics, hairdressing, and typing, right? Like those were kind of like these things that they were kind of pushing you to. And if you showed any like academic skills, you were popped out of the school immediately and put in a different program. And I was like, please let me be in the science program. Don't leave me with all of these horrible knuckleheads. Like the kid, like I show up at school with red hair and people just throw apples at me from afar. And then they all ended up in bands like Beowulf and Neighborhood Watch, later having to apologize for throwing apples at me for having red hair. But it was like, physical, going to school was like a physical danger, and the schools weren't set up to like figure out how to moderate that. And it'd be like, please. And like, I couldn't get into AP science because I wouldn't dissect a frog,
Mm, mm. Well, that's
right? Like, I could
yeah,
have been a doctor, fuckers. I could have been
yeah,
a doctor right now
yeah.
instead
Well, that's the thing I
of sitting
like.
on that punk podcast. I'd be making that 120K a year solving ADHD. But no,
Well, you wouldn't have made me wind up being a punk
and when
band.
I
And
say solving, I mean not solving.
no, I know what you're
But
saying.
go ahead.
Yeah, treating it better. But I guess you know what? And then there wouldn't be a generation of people like me involved in this music if you hadn't done this thing. So you continue
Yeah,
the
and then what
cycle.
would the world be like?
I
So self-important.
but I feel like you're right there because it's amazing how, but and I'm jumping all over the place with this, I guess, in my head, but isn't it amazing that there was this thing that you could kind of go into and express yourself with photography because school was sounds like it was not the place that was accommodating to you and certainly wasn't serving your creative interests, but then punk is some place where you could kind of go and kind of create your own world. And I'm idealizing it. I think it gets more like this as time kind of goes on and the time you're getting into
I
it.
know, but we glorify and glamorize art that has been created out of trauma. What are we going to do with that when we treat the trauma? Are we not going to have punk? Are we not going to have artistic expression? Are we not going to have people that are going to challenge the system? No, we are. But it's a mixed bag and it's nuanced and it's troubling and it should be.
Well, I feel like you're right 100%. Like anytime you write a song, you're like making money off your trauma. Or there anytime you're like truly opening yourself up and not being a character, like you're not like it's costing a little bit of your soul in a way. And
Mhm.
there's plenty of examples of people that this thing ate up alive and we're still listening to the songs that they wrote in trauma and
Mhm.
celebrating
Mhm.
them. And I it goes back to what you're saying, like not wanting to glamorize it. And
Yeah. There's this really good documentary. I can't remember it right now, but it's really about this idea of the rock star becomes the new sacrificial. And it was in the 70s. It's like called The Church of Rock or something. And it's pretty cool. It's about this. I mean, so it's not our generation. It's like kind of speaking before that the rock star becomes, the location of trauma for culture. And ultimately they need to die at 27
that's
and be
fascinating.
sacrificed, right?
Yeah.
And
Because
if
that
it's not, and I made it up, that it's mine.
you make it copyrighted. I got it. Say it here first. It's a verbal copyright because it is. I think that Pete Townsend says it in the history of time life history of rock and roll music punk episode
Mhm.
where he's like, you realize rock and roll is a fire and it's really romantic that there's this sort of fire burning there and then you realize
Yeah,
what's fueling the fire is bodies and it
right.
does it happens time and time again and then people are worth money and death and it's exploited further and it just
Hmm.
as one of the great tragedies I guess is like how much of this music costs people their lives to
And
put out there
art
and art
as
yeah
well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in the art world right now, modern and contemporary art, there's like a lot of conversation about like who gets to own it and it is as an asset, right? We always make this joke. We walk through the Broad Museum in Los Angeles, and I'm like, oh yeah, we're walking through Jay-Z's wallet right now. His stock portfolio. This is what the new stock portfolio looks like. But in a way, it's like then being able to create art, not necessarily with that trauma. And then in recent years, like in the last since COVID, it's really been about Basquiat and artists that did experience the trauma and died become the collectible again. And I'm like, why does this just cycle back and forth, in the high value?
And it's also like the idea of someone who creates something in life, in death, taking on another life, where they have no ownership of this thing that was intensely personal that they made. And I guess you lose ownership once you sell it out into the world. And can be
Mhm.
extended to music, but just how many people you look at what they've done, and it's like, would they be happy with what they've done with their legacy? Would they have wanted it to be used in this way? And yeah, there's certainly people that are now in. We There's a big exhibit that came through here of Keith Haring. Keith Haring, uh,
Yeah, yeah, we had that in LA. Exactly.
and my
Yeah.
kids went to it, and they came home and they were talking about like Keith Haring art and how much it sells for now and this idea, and it's so much against what Keith Haring kind of talked about. And obviously he was very commercial and commercialized his work. But at the same time, he was also someone that I think had a lot of populist values in doing so. And
Yeah, yeah. The show's called Anyone Can Do It, right? Is that
yeah,
the show?
I think so. That must be it. I didn't get a chance to go to it. I went to one the last time they toured Keith Haring way back when, but I think it was a little
Hmm.
more, I remember it was a little more adult themed than I think this one is. I think this one's a little
Right,
more
right, right. Yeah,
pop.
for anyone who's listening who doesn't know Keith Haring, he came up out of the New York scene in that late 70s period that we talk about all of these proto-punk bands coming out of, very much a part of the mix between, what they call uptown culture and downtown culture, which was like a synchronization between Black culture and white culture coming together for punk and art, which, was immediately slapped out of the culture like as fast as it could. But hip hop and later gangster rap and stuff was kind of born out of that. Keith Haring straddled it through an art expression of really early graffiti artists, right? That were like the kind of ones that would more easily exchange culture. But all of these guys were in bands together and they all played music together, Basquiat and Haring, and they all came out of this like, so it was this kind of idea of wanting to bring together these expressions in punk rock, that it wasn't just about music the way we think of it now, but it was about a lot of stuff coming together and reforming to create this movement. And then, Herring was gay. Um, a lot of his friends died, and he was a person living with HIV and then eventually passed away from complications. So, his expressions in a lot of his art are troubling about that, but they've been taken into pop culture and they're like, look at these fun drawings of this guy like crawling across the floor. And it's like, okay. And I'm not an art historian, so I'm just a fan, right? So though that story may not necessarily be like accurate, it's just my observation on information that's come to me on it. And now we have your kids going to the show and looking at it and people collecting it and selling it for really high volume. The interesting thing about his show is it's curated by a friend of his. And the interesting thing about the Basquiat show is it's being curated by his family.
Hmm.
His father, Basquiat's father was very protective of his son's work and was a businessman and would only allow his work to be shown if it was shown in the best possible light. And now his family has gotten the rights to it. The father's passed away, so they're showing Basquiat's work only in arenas that they can control. In Los Angeles, it was in a bank lobby, so
Wow.
irony. But they don't want to talk a lot about his sexual preferences. They don't want to talk about his gender preferences, and they certainly don't want to talk about his drug use. But they forefront the art itself, but they don't really forefront him. So I think that's a thing in music that we are starting to going to be look at too, where the family of Michael Jackson controlling Michael Jackson's work as opposed to the corporation that currently holds it.
Hmm.
right? Music
Hmm.
is going to the corporations, but art is kind of going to the families
It's also interesting when you kind
and
of,
thoughts.
well, I think when you see that happen in music, and you see this, like Kurt Cobain showing up as a playable character in Guitar Hero, and I never met him, but I cannot imagine he would have been stoked about becoming a playable character in a video
We
game.
don't know. We don't
We don't
know.
know. We don't know.
He
But
was nuanced and interesting, and he wasn't outside of exploitation. He signed to his record label. He knew what he was doing. He brought that along. He
it's,
wanted mainstream success. That's what he wanted.
but yeah, and
Yeah.
once again, I was not there, and I certainly didn't see it. But it feels like it was on a lot of it was is this it kind of environment too, where this is like you get this thing that you wanted, and especially with punk rock, it feels like this thing that we have this guilt that's like artificial, and that's the thing that like I find fascinating is we talk goes back to the very beginning of the conversation. We were talking about these people that have this adherence to these four letters that at the end of the day everyone's got a different definition of, but yet they have so much power over us. Like
Hmm.
certainly power over
Hmm.
me that I'm wasted most of my life talking to people about it, but it's still this like weird thing, and it's like a religion because it's arbitrary in the same way where it's seemingly arbitrary. I don't mean to diminish people's faiths, but like you could believe in any number of things, and we just happen to believe in punk, which is like,
Yeah.
what is it?
Yeah, it's so much like that Protestant rebellion, right? Like we don't know necessarily what it means to be, and I'm not a Christian, but we don't, and I'm just an observer of humans, right? And how humans organize themselves. So there's all these ways that you express Protestantism, especially in the United States, like all these different ways. But the one thing we know is we're not Catholic,
Yeah, we're defined,
right?
and I guess that with punk, that's
And
the
when I
thing.
say we, I'm not including
No,
myself
I
in it.
definitely, and you're
But
right. Like that's 100%, and I think that's the thing with Canadian. Like, what defines being Canadian? It's like DOA, Drake, and Degrassi, the three Ds, and not being American. Like those are the those are what we can cling to as Canadian identity.
right, right, right. Well, yeah, I mean, US identity was started on we're not British, right? And
Mhm.
like how to make that extra over the top to show that's what's happening. We're Puritans. We left England, like our part, like a very small trickle left England because they weren't religious enough. We needed more rules
Mhm.
about how to behave.
Mhm. And then it's funny because, and I think it's probably better now. I wonder. I don't know. Maybe it's better now, but there's a certain point where people are in direct conflict with each other, much like religion, because their definition of this little thing is different than someone else's definition of this little thing. And even though we're, the wart on the back of an ant culturally, we still find divisions within this community to kind of like put around ourselves and to say we're not like this person, we're not like that person. It's fascinating. It's like a real interesting thing to kind of like study, I find.
Oh my God. Well, yeah. That's you're in the conversation and the influence of punk and just being able to step back or like just have a little bit of age or wisdom around it. You start to look at it and go like, you know, are we just enacting a cultural expression at large? Are we just players in something that was going to happen in what's called post-modernity and anti-structuralism are the fancy, fancy, fancy pants words for it? Like where we're just breaking down everything that we knew about, they call it grand narrative,
Mm.
and we're breaking it all down. And then where is our identity in it? And then all of a sudden we're thugs storming the Capitol, right? Because all of a sudden our identities are so broken down. We're clinging to like identity culture.
Well, and it's not to
Thoughts?
not that well not to pin January 6th on punk rock because I don't think anyone wants that to happen. But you look at the roots of that thing. You look at the Proud Boys. You look at Gavin McInnes from Vice. He was a kid in a basement in Ottawa playing punk rock shows at one point, and that was
Oh
his
yeah.
entry point to
Yeah.
this whole thing too. It's the negative side of do it yourself on every level.
Right. 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 Well, right. I mean, yeah, but it's like it's not only just like I think that like the one thing Let's get so nerd on this. This might be the part where you need to edit.
No.
I feel I entered punk rock under the guise of I wanted to be in a community that cared. And I want to live in a society that cares about each other. Like that's my thinking. And my thinking is like, how could we not live in a society that cares about anyone who shows up? Anyone that says, I'm hungry, I need help, I'm sick. How do we not live? And it's interesting how other punk expressions are not about that. They're about this very like, how am I going to get ahead? How am I going to sell? How am I going to group these people around me so that they work for me to go do this thing? Or do you know what I mean? And all of these other ways. So it's like
Well,
totally interesting to look at these movements in America based on like kind of like conspiracy belief identity. They're getting one on us. We need to break down the system because didn't we want to break down the system in punk rock because it didn't care enough. They want to break down the system because it's something they're perceiving it as something draconian and different. And yeah, maybe punk rock did, you know, God Save the Queen was kind of part of that breaking down the colonialist system.
yeah, I think punk rock is like you're looking at the world and you can either be Joey or Johnny. You can be one side of this thing or the other side of this thing and believe that it's a wonderful world or and I actually had really good experience with
Yes.
Johnny, so I don't mean to cut him down horribly, but certainly the stories that you hear about Johnny, he wasn't always the nicest person and certainly politically didn't always align with the nicest people. And I
Mhm,
think
mhm.
that's baked into punk too. There is that side of this thing where
Where's the Dee Dee side?
I guess that's the other side of this thing. You're right. There is a Dee Dee and there's also a Tommy side. There's someone who likes it
Mhm.
just
And a
because of the
Marky. I
music.
think there's a Marky side too.
There's a Marky side. You're right. Someone that gets into it after a little bit, but brings something to it. And it's, you're right. You're right. We can just keep going on this. The whole
Wait,
thing is Ramones.
okay. It's clearly I'm either suffering from early stage dementia or late stage syphilis.
Or your
What is the
contact
name
high.
of the guy in the Gimme Gimmes? He's so sweet.
CJ.
CJ. There's a CJ side too.
You're right. 100%.
Well, current CJ side. There's a
Yeah.
CJ side.
Yeah. CJ was, I interviewed CJ and unfortunately their episode got lost. The recorder
What?
fucked up and it was gone.
Did he cry?
I did because the amount of insight he gave me into the Ramones and the way that band worked was fascinating
Yeah.
because it is obviously it's the foundation of so much of this stuff, but it's also just how it functioned as a unit is oh my gosh, like I watched many documentaries about that because it is a band where the band became bigger than the relationships between the individuals involved in it. Very early on, it seems like there was a real
Mhm.
animosity or not even animosity, just like a real lack of caring for certain people and between certain people in that band, it seems.
Interesting, right?
I gotta ask.
Fascinating.
There's like I have like sheets of questions that I meant to ask
Yeah,
you, and
I know. Okay. I have
I
a
feel.
CJ story. I have a CJ story. You
Please,
want to
I
hear
will
it?
go on with. I want to hear the story. Absolutely.
It's kind of personal.
Okay.
I should. Okay. He came up to me recently. We played a festival at the Gimme Gimmes, and CJ. I never really met him before. There's a really cute photo somewhere on my social of us together because he's very handsome. And he said, I want to tell you, I have a daughter, and my relationship with her has been like difficult, but she has come out to be who she is, and I'm so proud of her. And if it wasn't for bands like L7, I don't know if that would be possible.
That's awesome. And that's what we're talking about. The impact you've had is like,
And he cried
well,
like I'm
that's
crying.
immeasurable, right? Like the impact on that, like to have that kind of impact on, and there's countless people that you've had that impact on, and it's
Yeah, but no,
thank God you're not a doctor curing ADHD or whatever because we would.
I know, but check it out because my first thinking on it is, oh, did she become a doctor? Because like what? Yeah, like that's my first thinking. Like really, I mean, it's nuanced because I have a lot of my concern would be more influence, not so much people's like music or art expression, but in their ability. And I don't hear a lot of that.
Well,
Every once in a while, people will say like, yeah, this happened. I'm I run the council at my, housing development because I listen to L7.
Yeah,
You know what
but
I mean?
but I'm going to be honest. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I don't think I was ever going to be a doctor at the end of the day, Jennifer. I think what you did is give me somewhere to steer the ship that was kind of directionless in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of us that wind up making this music, it's because on a certain level we have to. There's like I certainly meet people on this podcast and I talk to people and I'm like, wow, you could have been doing anything. Like, what made you be involved in punk? And it's just because I look at you and you're very, they're high functioning people. And then there's other people, myself, where if it wasn't for punk, I would not be doing. I don't know what I'd be doing, but I certainly wouldn't be making any sort of music, and I probably wouldn't be doing much of anything.
So let's talk about it.
We got to talk
Okay.
about you.
Well,
I
we
mean,
talk about it because you know that there are ways, like, yes, you're doing great stuff. You're doing great work in the world. This is great work. But maybe you can, if there's other things that, like, maybe dreams that you've had to let go of at a time, like, yes, punk rock brings joy and it's fulfilling and you're like able, but maybe there were dreams like when you were 14, like, I want to be a veterinarian or a therapist or a firefighter. Some of those things go beyond us, but there are ways that, like, we're all living long lives, my friend. We're living long lives. In our generation's fronting this idea that, like, we're going to have multiple careers, we can do multiple things,
I
right?
like I wanted to collect comic books, and I enjoyed drawing comic books, and then I
Hmm.
probably would have wanted to be a professional acid taker for a short period of time.
Okay.
Uh, but then once I saw 1991, the year punk broke, I realized like, no, I just want to be. I would love nothing more than to be in a band, and maybe I should have set my ambitions a little higher, like being a veterinarian. But the fact that I'm found a way to kind of do it is testament to this kind of world and the power this
Of
world kind
course.
of had.
Would you ever consider that taking acid, you were doing that for a way for self-realization, for being, or not, self-realization is a weird word, so I didn't mean it, like self-reflection, being able to move yourself forward? I mean, that's like a really big deal. And that's something that, like, going into social work or therapy, maybe a couple of years from now, might be of interest to support people in that field.
I definitely feel like when I say I was a big Acid fan, I only did a few times. Like I really was not as much of a head as I make
Thank
it
you.
sound there. But
Oh, that's
I
enough.
feel like there was, yeah, I'm sure that's part of it. I think a lot of it was also trying to find a place where I felt like I belonged. And I felt like it was a group of friends of mine that were really into drugs at that point, but it wasn't necessarily the drugs. I feel like my enjoyment of it and all that stuff came by being part of a community. I feel like
Mhm.
that's really what I found in punk is that you could be part of a community and like we said before, there was barriers of entry and things like that, but it didn't matter how you dressed when you went to a punk and hardcore show. And people will talk about the
Did it
fashion
not
side.
matter how you dressed?
Not by the time I was there. I feel like
Okay.
post grunge, post um hardcore, a lot of that stuff kind of went by the wayside. There were still kids that charged their hair and it would call you a poser if you didn't have a leather jacket or things like that. But there was also a side of it that would be like, no, you're a poser if you wear a leather jacket because you're supposed to be vegetarian or vegan, or it just felt like a place you could just be yourself and
Hmm.
do your things. And once again, I tend to idealize it, but
Hmm. I want you to know that right now I'm wearing sweatshirts, sweatpants, and a sweatshirt. But if I
same.
rolled into a punk show, I don't know if people would be into that.
Are you kidding? You would be the height of fashion. You got on this podcast, Jennifer, and I'm like, oh my gosh, you're like
From
dressed up for this thing.
1991, okay? I'm not talking about now.
Oh, now. Yeah, no, back then it'd be different. Back then it was very different. But back then it's like you're talking about earlier on with that first wave having to shed that kind of rock star baggage of punk rock and then it was like the next wave where it changed. I think that
Isn't it
all
ironic that the person that forefronted, like, letting go of the rock star baggage was also the one that had to be sacrificed at the altar?
would Kurt, yeah. Yeah. I don't know. And once again, I never met him, but I do I do wonder how much of certainly drugs and everything he was dealing with, but I think I would wonder how much punk rock kind of like hung heavy on him. Certainly from all the books I read as a
Mhm.
kid, like that was a lot of my early understanding of this thing as not being like one style of music was hearing him
Mhm.
talk about the Vaselines or researching this kind of world where like the music doesn't have to be one sound, doesn't have to be one type of thing, but it's more like an ideology and sort of a mentality. And I think that's the sad thing is there's Nirvana wasn't, even though Nirvana was commercially the most successful punk band, there wasn't successful in the end because it cost someone their life before the whole story was told. And I think, like you're saying, that's the reality of that music to this day. When you listen to it in the car, and my kids are obsessed with Nirvana, like obsessed, and so we'll listen to it in the car and having to kind of broach that subject with them and kind of talk about it and sort of it led to some really good conversations with them about drug use and safety and mental
Mhm.
health and all sorts of things. But it is tragic music at the end of the day.
Yeah. It's funny that Kathy Wilcox interview you did where she was saying like we go to these, rock school for girls as they're singing our songs
Yeah,
and they weren't meant for children.
yeah.
And it's like, yeah.
Well, that's what you're saying about the Basquiat art or the Keith Haring art, where you have this art that existed in one space, and then you take it out of its context and give it a completely new thing where it's just a commercial artifact. It no longer has any of the
Hmm.
meaning that it kind of came out of.
Right. There's a word for it, right?
No, what is it?
Death of the artist.
Death of
It's
the
like
artist? Okay.
Death of the artist. It's a concept by writer Roland Barthes, who said that when you create, and there's also a media guy named Stuart Hall that like any object is not just the creators, it's who's receiving it. It's like what it's in, the purpose of its receivers, right? And Death of the Artist is about like how you have to sometimes separate the artist from the art, that you let something go and it's going to be interpreted and become something different because the audience is going to, no matter whether it's commercial or not, the audience is going to hold an interpretation for it.
Oh, absolutely. That makes yeah. I've definitely heard of separating the art from the artist, but I think as an artist, there's and broadly speaking, me as an artist, but there's you have to surrender your thing, and then it will take on a completely different life with the person who receives it, so much to the point that it will affect how they interact with everything you make after that, where you're now competing with their nostalgia. If it works, like if a
Right,
song hits with that person, they're going to be stuck with that song whenever they listen to anything you make for the rest of your life, even though it's just one brief moment of expression for you.
right,
It,
right, right. Sure.
it's yeah, I'm fascinated by that. I think that is such an interesting
Yeah.
part of this whole thing.
Yeah, becoming your own cartoon in a way
Hmm.
that's like
Well, like you were saying about Courtney Love writing this book, where there's just so much character put onto a person at a certain point, especially the bigger you are, where you eventually have a choice. You either reject it or you have to play to it, but it's never really you. Like it's never.
mhm,
It's like pro wrestling. It's very much a pro wrestling character, but not of your choosing.
right.
Um, Jennifer, this has been one of my favorite conversations I've ever gone to have, and I got to say, anytime you want to come on this show, if you want to be my regular
What?
co-host, you're always welcome on this thing.
Oh, okay. Well, then, okay. I have,
What about like because you're like you're going up the coast and you're playing the Gilman and all these types of shows, and I find it's in the documentary. You talk about when you go and play that Fugazi show. I think it's a Rock for Choice benefit in DC,
mhm.
and Bikini Kill's on the show, and how you don't fit
It
in
was, it
there.
was the Women's March. So it was a little
Women's March,
bit,
sorry.
yeah, Rock for Choice is a little bit different. Rock for Choice, like, went to specifically help protect women's health. Like, it was very specific.
So I think the Women's March show that you played there, you're always in kind of disparate scenes. Like it's a band that doesn't really fit into any one scene as much as you fit into like just the history of punk rock. So what was it like? Like, what did you find? Like, you're
But it's
playing
a,
a.
It's not just the history of punk rock. It's like really the history of culture of the time. It like even spans like we are embraced at punk shows, but we're also embraced at metal shows.
Hmm.
Like we have a whole other side. That's mostly more maybe Europe and South America, but it where we, play metal shows with Kiss. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like with Kiss headlining and
But I mean, like as a band that kind of came out of punk, now interacting with all the manifestations of this thing, was there one place that you felt kind of more at home playing a show? Like you're playing a show with Green Day and The Offspring, and obviously there's a difference in years, but then you're also playing shows with like Fugazi and Bikini Kill. Like there's clearly a gulf between it, and No Effects too. Like there's all these different sort of scenes that you're interacting with. Like where did you feel most at home playing shows?
in front of 8 million people in Brazil, and I
Yeah.
don't even care who else was on the show.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I like that you're talking about feelings because they're kind of my specialty. Where did we feel at home? I mean, the answer is that we felt at home in multiple places. We felt at home touring with Bad Religion in 1988, 89. We felt at home, playing with Mudhoney. We felt at home touring with Melvins. Felt at home every time we go. Like for some reason, I don't know if you've noticed this lately, but for some reason we're paired with suicidal tendencies, which we love them, but I grew up with them. We're friends with them. It's not necessarily like as I talked earlier, it's not necessarily an aesthetic choice. Do you know what I mean? But we
Yeah.
get booked with them a lot. And there's certainly no crossover in the audience, I feel like, but maybe there is, and I just don't know.
It might be the only band that you and Donita both brought up is Suicidal Tendencies. She was
Oh,
saying that her and
I'm
Susie love
obsessed.
that band as
Yeah, it was the meeting point. I mean, there were a lot of meeting points, like aesthetically and musically, that we have that wouldn't be expected. We love Black Flag as much as we loved Black Sabbath. You know, I think that there were also like definite expressions where we would maybe start writing music and people would ask us, "Oh, you're fans of the Runaways, right?" And like we would all be like, I don't know who that is. I mean, I know Joan Jett produced the Germs, but I don't know who the Runaways are. And it was almost like pearl clutching, but all the members of L7 had the same experience. It's not like we're being mean. We're just saying it got skipped or missed, or like, oh, that's what we're supposed to be into, or something, and as you know, from my history, and I also, you look into Danita and Susie's, who are also amazing storytellers and have experiences as well. L7 is four really distinct, unique voices, four distinct, unique experiences in of itself to come together and to play music. We're not sycophants of each other, or you know what I mean? It's like a very unique situation. So therefore, I think like it probably reflects in a subconscious way of how people view us. Did you see the Barbie movie?
I did.
Okay. One thing about the Barbie movie that I think was great storytelling is you could have 10 people go see it and 10 people will walk away with different impressions of what that movie was about.
Hmm.
And because it's so well crafted in that sense, like someone could just love the costumes or someone could just love the music, and I didn't hate the costumes, nor did I hate the music. So it's just interesting about it is. And I think L7 is, I'm not comparing us to that movie. Maybe we need an edit here. But I'm saying that I think we're part of movement and culture that really can embrace different expressions and still be 100% authentic. And that authenticity, that voice is what really speaks in L7. We're
I, that,
not, we're not, you know, and I love music now. I love Nozzle I love Doja Cat. I love all of these YouTubers out there showing, doing all their shit. But I know they're cartoons. That's not the authentic person, but I know that.
but
And they switch out their costumes and their characters very quickly. And it's like, wow, who are you going to be next? But
that's
I
what
think,
oh, go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to keep going off.
no, go ahead.
That's what I loved about this music, though, is because there wasn't characters. It wasn't Kiss. It was here's who I am, and here's what I deal with, and it's not pretty, and it might not be romantic or sellable to mass audiences, but it's real and authentic, and I think that's That's the thing I also love about L7 is that it was always like a real band. It never felt like it was from a genre or playing to a genre. And then now talking to you, well, two of you, and watching the documentary and getting to know a little bit more about the band, growing up and kind of loving the band, you realize like, oh yeah, it's four different people that are coming from four different places and making this band. So of course it doesn't sound like any one thing or anyone else because it's four perspectives becoming one.
Right. And I love that. But
Hmm.
it also it's not always like necessarily that even that simple because Danita came to hardcore shows. Danita and I went and saw plenty raging ass hardcore shows. You know what I mean? There was no question. Late 80s LA big Fender's ballroom style hardcore shows. We also went, we all went to Black Flag shows. We all went to suicidal shows. We also all went to, queer dance clubs. We all went to, see expressions of, crazy art and drag queens and all kinds of stuff. It's like, I guess it's just, you could say like maybe we front certain things a little bit more. I don't know.
I would
It's
definitely say
hard to
that.
be in the, explain the 90s to me.
Well, no, because I think
Explain the
but just back to Danita when she was on, talked about how terrible hardcore was and how it did ruin the scene and how it made her and Susie kind of run away from it. And
Sure.
very different than your interactions with it. So even though you guys are going to the same things, well, from what
Right.
you've said earlier on in the show,
Right,
I
right,
mean,
right, right, right.
it
Right,
just
for sure.
it's like
Right.
different
And we all ended
takeaways.
up at Raji's, right? I mean, basically
Yeah,
we all ended up at Raji's, which was a very what they call LA post-hardcore venue, right? Where
ev-
you get
ev-
all those bands. Trash Can School, Black Angels, Death Song, the Muffs, all these bands kind of came out of that scene. And there's more.
is that pre Jabberjaw? I guess because Jabberjaw is kind of like that too, a little bit later, right?
Just by a couple years, I mean, the LA timeline is like very quick,
Hmm.
very quick.
When you went to Europe, what were some of the bands you were kind of seeing that were like European bands? Were there any European bands you kind of were?
Oh no, I didn't see any bands. I mean, I was in, squats that didn't have band. I mean,
Okay,
yeah,
it was a
yeah,
different scene.
yeah. Super good question. I did see bands later on.
Hmm.
I came back to LA after 1986. I joined L7. I started working for a guy named I won't say his name, but he came in, he was a booker from the East Coast that came to Los Angeles to book at Triple X Records, and I was his assistant. And his idea, and this is like, I really need to get a year on it, 88, 89. His idea was to do legacy punk because at that point punk was legacy.
Yeah,
So he was bringing over bands like Scritti Politti, The Damned, all
GBH
these
probably or
GBH. Yeah, he brought over
yeah.
these shows and put them into Godzilla's, which was kind of going at the time. And that's where and the country club in Los Angeles. So we did like this version of Sam Hain or something like originally, and then Bad Religion was on the bill, and this Scream came out. So I kind of have this like late 80s sort of conversational relationship with the bands that also I would say Scream because then Scream went on to do a squat
Wool.
tour that was in
Oh,
Europe like a second time, right? And
yeah.
then they became Wool. Dave went and joined Nirvana.
Scream is a fascinating band. Like obviously the Nirvana stuff, but like the Stahl brothers and
Yeah,
well,
you've
you
had
worked
them
with
on,
them.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because like they used to go to England and they'd stay with my friend Robbie Brookside, who's now the head trainer for the WWE in
Oh
Florida.
wow.
But it's just like they're one of those bands that connects so many because they toured and they got out there and they weren't just committed to their scene like a lot of the DC bands seem to have been kind of trapped a little bit more.
Hmm. Yeah, there's one of the things that I think that's like, when you're starting out, the importance of it's not just the show, but it's kind of staying at people's houses, which is always like a spin of the roulette wheel, right? Because Fugazi's sound guy, Joey P, is currently L7's sound guy. And did you know that Pete manages basically up until recently that Scream re-released a record? Like Pete Stahl wasn't, managing L7 in part, our production manager. And so we're still working with everyone, right? So like you go out with Joey P And between all of us, we know everybody in every city. Like there's always someone's house to go to. There's always a dinner to go to. In 2023, do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like right in, like we were in South America and it was just like, oh yeah, come meet Blanca. Her family owns this restaurant and, Belo Horizonte, it's where Fugazi stayed and some 90s date, and or oh hey, the L7 came in 93 and we stayed at this person's house and.
Well, that's the thing when it gets really interesting is once it starts breaking out of Canadian American borders, like DIY culture, and it's obviously in Europe through the squat system, and it spreads all over the world. And there's this idea that we can go theoretically to this day. I can go to a place that I've never been, call up some friends, ask if you've ever been to this city. Do you know anyone I could meet up with, and probably find a place to stay, just because we're all
Yeah, yeah.
tapped into this network that's still
Yeah.
thriving and surviving.
Yeah. You know what's super crazy is, I know bands like on like way higher level, like Devo and Blondie, who are still touring to this day, and they have those same experiences. Because I'll call up like their TM, like, hey, where you guys stay? Oh, we're staying at a friend's house in Brisbane. I'm like, what? You're not in town? Yeah, we're in a friend's house. But I'd start to see where there's different levels of houses now. Like the house that they're staying in
Yes.
is not the same squat house in like northern Toronto that like we stayed in.
I feel like also there's few places that can be lonelier than a hotel room. And we,
I feel the same way. I
yeah,
tell Seven that a lot. Like, the gals really like to have their own rooms, and I'm still the one that's like, I'm scared. This is where people go to die. Like, I don't want to be in here. Don't you read the biographies? Like, this is where it all happens. Someone chokes on a sandwich, and then they get blamed for being a drunk. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, yeah. No, there's
yeah.
it is
Like, can I
there,
room with the crew or something?
because there's
Like, Susie, stay with me. I'm like, Susie, what are you doing? Let's get dinner. Danita, what are you doing? Let's get dinner. Dee, what are you doing? Let's get dinner.
because it's like it's like a one bedroom apartment, and you're in a different one every night, so it's never homely, and you're never truly there. As much as I do love when we get our solo rooms, there's a comfort that comes when you have to stay with someone in your band because, like you're saying, there's a post. Well, this is off of their air, so maybe I should edit it. But like, there's a post tour depression, but there's also just like a post show depression that I think we all have to deal with every night, where you have to get off stage and come down from it. Like, how do you come down when you get
Oh
off
my
that
God,
stage?
I love that come down. You don't,
Uh, I got to
yeah,
ask you about working with Hide from X.
Hide. Yeah, whoa, that was gnarly. That was a gnarly experience. What a great artist. Um, didn't really know who Hide was, but the story of their ex Japan or Exu came to Los Angeles at one point in the early 90s because they wanted to record and they wanted to break it. And we are just will not let a band break America. Like you just don't get it. And so they came to LA and they had like kind of this cultural LA club experience. And I think that they kind of were observers of both punk and like the hair metal scene and the metal scene. And, they did all this stuff and they went back to Japan and broke in their own country. Surprise, surprise. But not like break like how we break, mega break, like not able to walk on the streets, not able to have lives, not like mega, mega, mega break. And they each member of the band went to do their own separate sort of experience that they wanted to have independently. And Hide was like, I want members of L7 to play in my band. That's what I want to do with my money and my fame and my control. I want women. I want to forefront women to be in my band and in my artistic expression. And it's like, they were doing it in the early 90s, right? Maybe
94, I think it
94.
came out, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And Dee and I are like, okay, well, Dee and I are so dumb. We're like, okay, we'll go do this. And it was insane. So the first thing that we wanted to do was to show them what Americans can do. Is I wore a fake pregnancy suit. So it looked like that I was like 8 months pregnant the entire press that we were there. And Dee dressed in like, Sailor Moon stuff, but beat up. And we're talking her look was proto, like it was not done. Do you know what I mean? And not in mainstream Japanese culture. So the first thing that happened is we got off the plane and the manager sat us down and was like, we we cannot have this. We cannot do this. And we were like, well, we could leave. Like we didn't care. We
Yeah.
were like, we can leave. Like, and they brought Hide in, and Hide was like, no, this is what I want. So you'll see these videos and these promo clips. And it was the 90s. So it was like controlled and taped, but we did tons of interviews, tons of photo sessions, and they're kind of just coming out now with all of that. And Hide committed suicide.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Really
haven't seen the
sad. Like
movie.
and like Dee and I every once in a while are like, oh my God, was he killed? Like sometimes we're like, think that, I mean, I know that's a weird thought, but we're like, he was so out there and so such a rebel, like within a culture that nope, you know, and we saw that firsthand, like his interactions, his not able to, do what he wanted, to go where he wanted. I mean, it was 100% like all the things you hear about like K-pop now, right? Like all that stuff that comes out, like the camping and the pressure and the you have to look a certain way. Like your body has to stay a certain age, all that stuff.
Well, because you like, I guess we've talked about this
And
earlier.
it was the 90s, so can you explain it to me?
Yeah, well, I just saw it. I was just taking it in as it was being projected for me. I never got to see it from the inside, but it does feel like it's probably the same way now too, with like the idea that you become a commodity to someone and your value to someone is staying on the road and continuing to do what you do, and they're willing to look past cries of help. Willing to look past terrible behaviors in some cases. They're
Right?
willing
They
to look.
wouldn't allow us, I'll bring a video camera and, I'll bring a camera, I'll bring all that stuff. And they were like, well, you need to put that, we're locking it, we're going to take it. And I'm like, "Nah," it was like every step was an argument, every step.
Wow, but I guess that's the level of well, like you're saying, they're so huge. How much money are they worth to
Yeah.
someone at this point? Like it's no longer about songwriting; it's about units shifted.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah.
And you see how, as someone who's a creative person, that could become incredibly dehumanizing and incredibly demoralizing. And obviously, once again, there's larger factors that go into people's mental health. But this can't be good for someone's mental health, and no one's going to stop it.
Can we call it exactly what it is?
What's that?
Late stage capitalism.
You're right.
It is exactly what it is. The spectacle, the control, the commodifying, the
Hmm.
cost of human life, labor. It's all in there.
Like it is late stage capitalism. It's also, well, it's so, I guess, illustrative of that, the fact that like they've taken these things that were rejections and rebellions to culture and society and whatnot, and they've they've turned them into commodities for culture and society. Graffiti
Mhm.
being a great example, like graffiti art and co-opting graffiti art. I thought it was amazing when the Gap started. Well, not amazing, terrible in its amazingness, but when the Gap started making the signage look like spray paint on their windows, yet
Mhm.
you go to jail if you
Yep, we're
spray paint.
done.
Yeah, but you go
Drop
to
the mic. Drop the mic. Drop the spray paint can. Walk away.
yeah. But also back to what you were saying about Basquiat and sort of the scene that gave birth to Keith Haring. It's also the scene that gives birth to punk rock and hardcore in a lot of ways, especially
Yeah,
hardcore,
exactly.
graffiti in
Exactly.
particular. And it's
Oh yeah,
like
yeah.
it's fascinating how it's another visual medium that kind of is born, I guess, out of the crumbling of society.
Have you had any from one from Sick of It All on the show yet?
No,
Yeah,
no,
that's a good story because
I
they were
know.
youngsters and they were in the city. They weren't in the suburbs.
I would love to talk to Pete and Lou because I think, yeah, like you're saying, hugely fascinating story, hugely important
Mhm.
piece
Yeah,
of,
I did punk rock museum tours with Pete and we were alternating.
yeah.
What a great look at audience, right? Like just looking at who would go on his tours and who would go on my tours. I have like these, nerdy weirdo, like 14-year-old kids that have like just consumed everything. Okay, wait, not 14, 17, 18, like
Yeah.
a little bit older, 18 to 20 probably. Um, that consumed everything would be on my tours. And he would just have like older dudes that were just like, dude. And Pete's like smart, you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And so he's like talking about all this stuff, and they're like, yeah, but did you smoke weed with Dee Dee?
I had a pretty
He
big
would tolerate it. I would not tolerate it.
I,
I would
I
be like,
I went opposite Fred Armisen with mine, and so we had a big juxtaposition of him having a trillion people and me having a smattering.
yeah,
As I said before, Jennifer, I got a trillion more questions for you. So anytime you want to come on this podcast in any way, shape, or form, you are always welcome.
that's excellent. What does your audience think about that? Since we're including the audience in the we.
As we know, the audience is meaningless. You know, when I say we, I mean Tristan and me. That's who this podcast is ultimately for.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate being on so much. And as you know, I'm a big fan. So thank you so much for having me on. And I'm so excited to kind of talk about some of the stuff. We got really nuanced. It might bore people, but I don't know. Welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer, for coming on the show. And you heard right there, Jennifer will be back for future episodes of Turn It a Punk. I guarantee that. We got a lot more to talk about. Woo, that was a lot of fun. That's why we do this thing. Check out l7theband.com for all sorts of stuff. There's just too much to tip you to that's on the site. It's a fantastic site. Lots of stuff. You haven't seen this documentary? The documentary is great. Everything's great. Hopefully she does a book one day. A photo book. Jennifer, do that photo book. Oh my gosh, we need that. Oh. All right. On to the next episode. On the next episode, a Turned Out a Punk. From the bands Cold World, Iron Age, Power Trip, War Hungry. The producer behind this guy's got more entry on Discogs than I think anyone else we've ever had on the show. I think we established that one time on a footnote, Chris O'Toole and I, way back when. Arthur Rizek is on the show, and this is a good one. There's a lot of great stories in this one. Arthur's journey is fantastic. One of the nicest people in hardcore, one of the most talented people in hardcore, and he will be here on the next episode. And that is it. Remember, as always, Black Lives Matter. The lives and issues faced by Indigenous peoples all over the world matter. We need to protect trans kids and help trans people protect themselves and their rights and stop hate and violence towards people of different faiths and different races and different nationalities, because everyone deserves the right to live free from violence and hate and oppression. So if there's organizations that are affecting positive change in this world, get involved. Donate your time, donate your money, because this isn't politics, this is human rights. And you'll start feeling better if you can make the world a little bit better. And it's a lot. I know there's so much going on and it's overwhelming, but something is better than nothing. Speaking of something being better than nothing, give something to your local punk scene. Start a band, start a fanzine, start a podcast. Not a podcast. Do something. It gets better when you contribute to it. Speaking of getting better, people get better when you sign your organ donor cards and you can donate your organs. You don't need them by the time they come looking for those organs. And I've seen them perform miracles with my own eyes. So sign that thing. And then try meditating, because you might as well give your brain a break. And it can be frustrating, it can be hard, but don't think of it as something that, like, believe me, this is the most amateur person in the world telling you advice on meditation, but think of it as like something to look forward to, like just like a moment to kind of like take a break and not something you have to do. And if that helps at all, good. But if not, just let it pass through your brain. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening, and I will see you on the next episode. Goodbye.